All right. So thank you for joining. Like we said, we're excited. This is we do these joy research updates from time to time. We're kind of on a quarterly basis. This update is focused on our first publication about the findings that we've done in the research. And so it's been an excellent experience for us, especially last year because we got to interview so many people during the lockdown about what joy at work means to them and how it shows up in their organizations. Like what a great what a great thing to do while you're locked at home. So anyway, so we're excited to share with you what we found. So the research is based on these three major things, in addition to our own experience. But these three major things, we have interviewed leadership teams in totality about what their best team experience is. So we'll share some information about that. And then last year we started doing one-on-one interviews with CEOs and senior leaders about what joy at work means to them, how it shows up in their organizations. We're on our way to 100 interviews. And the reason for that is we want to be able to publish in academic journals. So we're still progressing, and then of course we're reading a lot of academic literature and also some popular literature as well on the subjects. So what came out of the research is 10 dimensions of joy at work. And so we're going to share that with you. We recognize that's a lot of dimensions. So far, we have not been able to get rid of any or consolidate. But who knows what's going to happen in the research, but that's what we have so far. And we just want to share, generally speaking, joy at work is about creating the conditions to help people thrive in their work, especially in times of change. People think about joy in different ways, especially in the workplace, and this is how we think of it. And when you think about in times of change, that's probably potentially a mental stretch because naturally people don't naturally think of joy and change. They think of other things. As a matter of fact, this is one of the things we heard from one of our executives last year, that change is a joy killer, which was like a punch in the gut for me personally, because I think of it exactly the opposite, in the opposite way. And this is a little bit of how we think about change and joy and how they go together, which is, how you do the change, how you implement the change can either grow or diminish joy at work, which we see as these 10 dimensions on the right hand side. And the presence of joy at work or not can actually impact how well the change goes. So it's kind of a cycle, right? So I'm not going to go into this in detail yet. I want to go more into the research so that you can see, what you can do with this. And why should you care about this? Well, culture directly impacts your ability to attract, retain, and engage people. We know this. We saw there's an article on Fast Company recently that talked about 52% of the U.S. workers are considering a job change. I just saw something on Business Insider this morning about how to resign from your company in the great post-pandemic resignation boom. Lots of signs out there that people are thinking about a change. And so this was a problem. This is something that executives thought about beforehand, right? I mean, I'm certain that you think about this. How am I engaging my people? How am I attracting the talent that I want? How am I competing with others to, retain the folks that I have? So naturally, culture is a big impact on that. But so where does this come from? So first we wanted to share the inspiration before we go into the research, because this is why we even thought that this was possible, this story. And some of you here may have been part of this and may remember it your own way. And this is how we experienced this situation. So 10 years ago, Ed and I were working on a program, was a system implementation that was pretty big, impactful thing. 250 people on the program team, impacting 15,000 employees and millions of customers. But unfortunately, it was an onion. It had many layers. It was not properly scoped in the beginning. And as a result, We were over budget and way off schedule, not a good thing. The team was really suffering. Lots of people were jumping ship. And then worse, lots of people were forced to stay on it. And then at the annual meeting that the CEO holds for the entire company, he calls this a disappointment, which was a real problem for everyone, especially those 250 people on the team. And then, of course, the people who were about to receive this system, they were, obviously lacking confidence in it. And so we were definitely in what we call the pit of despair. So what did we do? We decided, rather than jump ship ourselves, that we were going to set an intention to lead in a completely different way. So we set an intention, got the leadership team to help develop that intention. We did a lessons learned, which was sort of a cathartic thing to agree on never to make those mistakes again. And then we decided to lead together. And inside 2 weeks, there was a shift on the leadership team's mindset. It was amazing. Started to see signs of that right away. And inside 3 months, we saw a shift on the entire program team. So the leaders started thinking about themselves differently. We started to have very different scores and engagement. I mean, it was really interesting. People were trying to get off the program. Suddenly people were trying to figure out how to get on the program. That was a major shift for us. And in essence, we were under new management. It was the same management, but under new management in terms of how we thought about it. So what happened? Because we had this intention and we constantly created this condition so that people could feel like they could be themselves and do their best work, it started to have an impact on the employees that were receiving this system eventually. And they started to really feel confident and excited about it. And we started to actually celebrate. And you could see the impact of the ecosystem. The 250 people were having a positive impact on the employees, and they were having a positive impact on the customers. And it was really funny. There was lots of anecdotal stories about the customers asking the employees, when is your new system coming in? Who does that? I mean, why would they care? I mean, they were obviously very excited about. So it went from a disappointment to the biggest success in that part of the organization. And it was this group of people who went from a disappointment to major rock stars. And this was amazing because really everyone could have, and they did initially have fiefdoms and self-protected, but they really pulled together. It never got easy. There was not one day in the 18 months remaining that it was easy. It was always difficult, but again and again, everyone pulled together. And it was largely because of that intention we set and our commitment to it. So that's our inspiration story. Ever since then, we've been trying to figure out, okay, what happened and how can we replicate that for ourselves and others? And from that point on, that experience was expected of me in any change that I did. So I never really focused too much on the program team before. I did as a stakeholder, but not in a very deliberate, strategic way. And from that point on, I did. So today we want to give you a definition of joy at work that comes out of the research. We want to give you an example of one of the dimensions, and we want to give you some thoughts on how you can practically apply it. So first, the definition. So like I said, we did interview these 9 leadership teams and have interviewed 52 CEOs. And so let's see what they said. So what does the phrase joy at work mean to you? These are the things they said. Bring your whole self to work, seeing meaning in my work and knowing I'm fulfilling my purpose, being called to a purpose, not despite the company, but because of the company. So there's an inspiration there and there's alignment there. So that's the kind of thing that you will see in the book. These are the themes that came out. And then in answer to the question, the best team you've ever led or been part of, these were largely the themes. We were all there to support each other. We had a hard goal to go after, and we were clear on our destination. It was hard, but we all focused. We took risks, and sometimes we failed, but mostly we believed we could recover. The thing about this set of responses, they're a little bit more specific because it's something that people experience. So they can point to it specifically. And one of the things we notice when we talk to them about this is that they light up because they remember this very positive experience. It's very specific. The question before about what does it mean to have joy at work, what we noticed is people wanted to answer the question, but they were not used to answering it. So it was like a little bit vague, and then they would start to get going and start to tell stories. And it seemed as though they were a little frustrated with their almost like ambiguous words. But here they could clearly say, this is what happened. This is why it was so great. So out of this, plus the research that we've been doing in academic literature, this is the definition that we see and the dimensions that we see. It's joy at work is employee willingness to do these things: participate, commit, be accountable, trust, belong and act with cohesion, adapt and grow, demonstrate respect, and act with integrity. And it happens when company leaders and managers, basically the management structure in the company, create the conditions and then extend the invitation to employees to behave this way, and that employees constantly accept the invitation. The reason why that's important is you might think it's the company that needs to do this, right? Well, yes, but the company can create these conditions and an employee might not actually step in and respond, right? We've been in those situations where we've led and don't understand why employees are not responding. And then vice versa, you can be an employee and behave in these ways, but if the company doesn't value it, it's hard to get traction with that behavior, and it can be frustrating as an employee. So it's a two-way street. So how can this happen? So one of the things that that you probably know about, that we've certainly studied a lot, is this notion of psychological safety. And so psychological safety is something that Amy Edmondson coined. She's a Harvard professor in this study back in 1999. And she's got lots of things out there. She's got a great TED Talk, definitely worth looking into. But these are some of the things that happen when there is psychological safety, which is the shared belief that if I take risk, I'm going to be okay. If I take personal risk and admit mistakes, or just be vulnerable in some way for that culture, it's actually not going to be bad. It's actually going to be good because we're all kind of, quote unquote, leaning into it. So this is the idea of psychological safety. And then we think also that once you have cultivated this for a while, you build up emotional capital, which is a trusting relationship over time. And everyone benefits, right? So these are the kinds of things that happen when there is emotional capital, right? There's loyalty to the company. There's more forgiveness when a leader makes mistakes. There's just a coming together that happens when you have a bank of emotional capital. So we see this as over time accumulating. So there's psychological safety, so people are stepping in. It's a built up of emotional capital and a trusting relationship. And then there's joy, and that joy emotional connection is to their work, to their colleagues, and to their company. So that's how we think of how this can happen. So I want to give you a real example of one of the dimensions. In the ebook, you'll find this. These are the dimensions, and it shares, okay, what is this? How is this characterized from an employee willingness standpoint? And we also, you'll notice on the left-hand side that we see we're characterizing the risk level for each one. And this is relative to each other. And so participation is the highest risk. Kind of obvious there. It's obvious when someone is participating, right? It's pretty obvious that when their work is participating, and also because they're participating, they can't participate in other things. They have to choose wisely. And sometimes they find that they haven't chose wisely and they had no way of predicting that something was going to shift in the environment. Anyway, so it's definitely a high risk thing. Integrity is the lower risk because it's actually harder to detect whether or not you have integrity. So there are ways that you can appear to have integrity, and so from a personal standpoint, it's lower risk.
I think this is also one of the things that showed up as a surprise for the executives that we interviewed. We wouldn't ask them about it more directly, but start to probe a little bit around how they would think about it. And these 10 that are here, they didn't always use the same word and didn't always describe it exactly in the same way, but it was the descriptions that we kind of jumped on. And I think as we progressed and started to introduce the idea of risk, that's been one of the things that's generated this sort of pause in the conversation. You can kind of see the person sit back and think about it and haven't contemplated where is the risk for the employee as much in this whole idea around building up from psychological safety to emotional capital to joy. So what's interesting, what I find interesting about that is Roxanne used to talk about risk around change, a zillion years ago when doing this kind of work. And so to see it show up here in these dimensions of joy, I think has been one of the more interesting things for seeing that connection and how these things are interwoven together.
So I want to zoom in on one of these, which is trust, right? This is a popular one. So it's employees' willingness to risk being dependent on others for personal success. That could be dependent on the company, right? Not just on other people, but the company as well. And so inside the ebook, we have a one-page summary for each of the dimensions that covers these things, the signs that it's working well or not, what's surprising about that dimension, the personal risk that employees have to behave and engage that way, and why this is an important dimension for or contributor to joy in the workplace. So I want to focus in on trust for a moment. So with trust, we characterize it in this way. So as a person, I'm willing to put myself at risk by depending on others. And I might be willing to grant a lot of trust right from the start and tolerate a lot of breaches of trust. But once it's broken, it's really hard to get it back with me. Or I may be slow to trust because I want to see consistency in words and actions first. I also may be hard to read because I feel I have to have a facade of trust before and just be really cautious about it before truly extending it. And if trust is absent, I'll seek ways to reduce my dependence or I'll compensate in some way. My life's experience tells me what's wise, but I'd much rather trust than not because that means I'm free to do my work. I'm free to engage with my colleagues and enjoy the work. So this is how a person might describe it. It's a little, but the language wouldn't necessarily be this way, but this is the subtext, I would say, of how they would describe it. And so some of the signs that trust is working well is the open sharing of ideas, offers an acceptance of help without concern of hidden agendas or being thought of as weak. The offer of help is one of those things that it's tricky, right? You can offer help and feel like you've been slighted. So it's very tricky thing. So when you have that feeling of trust, that you don't think about that as a hidden agenda. Also, signs that it's working is there are experiments. Failures are responded to with curiosity first rather than judgment first, right? Risks raised it's common practice with the intent to make informed decisions rather than point fingers. And there's no worry about repercussions. Decision-making is delegated at appropriate levels, right? And information sharing is happening at an appropriate pace and detail so that that employee can actually be successful in their role. And just a general feeling of being able to succeed. So these are some signs that it's really working. So some signs that it's not working is when there's an imbalance of time and effort spent by an employee managing up. Before making commitments that are appropriate for their role, they're doing a lot of checking with their supervisor first, right? So there's a trust issue potentially. Same thing on the manager side, an imbalanced percentage of time and effort spent by a supervisor monitoring, right? Because the employee, the managers needs to trust the employee, right? Coaching and directing of their employees, supervisors, unable to make or keep commitments as a result of that, right? Because they're so focused on monitoring their employee. Careful and measured communication, hedging when making commitments, right? Energy draining conversations, and alliance is frequently made between employees for the purpose of self-protection, right? Those are some signs that trust is not really working well in the organization. What's surprising about this dimension is the degree of dependencies on others and the risk tolerance of those involved are big drivers of trust behavior. So if I have a lot of tolerance if I have a high risk tolerance, I'm more likely to trust. But if I don't, then I'm less likely to. So why do we think of this as a high risk situation? Well, the giver and receiver of trust have some amount of risk. A person's ability to accurately judge the intention, values, character, and competencies of others is part of the situation. The supervisor-employee relationship is the highest risk relationship for both parties. Supervisors dependent on the employee to deliver valuable work. Employees dependent on the supervisor for fair performance reviews, compensation, and treatment, and typically has the power to fire the employee, right? So this is a very high risk situation. And this is an important contributor to joy in the workplace, because when people are willing to trust and be trusted, and the organization acts in ways that supports that willingness, they're free to focus on the work itself and not preoccupied with evaluating their risk of engagement, right? So that's why it's an important contributor of joy at work. So this is an example of one of the dimensions, and it leads to questions like this. If you're a leader, how are you creating the conditions and inviting employees to behave in these ways? But also, what makes it difficult for you to create these conditions? Because there might be some things in the way of you doing that as a leader. And then as an employee, how are you contributing joy at work by behaving in these ways, and what puts you at risk to do so, right? Questions like that can be really helpful to try to figure out, okay, so what can I do with this?
This back and forth is kind of two-way between leaders and employees. But another thing that has popped up that's been really interesting to explore. We can talk with people in companies that will have employees. Will talk about, if I want to be trusted, I want to receive trust from my supervisor, from the leaders that are there. But oftentimes we'll miss the fact that that has to go in the other direction as well, that leaders have a risk around trusting employees. And it's been interesting to talk about that with people, because I think it opens their eyes to the two-way street part of this, and has them think about it in a different way, and how they act is going to have an impact on that trust as well. And it's something I think at one level everybody certainly knows, but seems to forget sometimes. And that reminding itself has been useful to have a more full view of what it's going to take to grow joy at work this way.
Yeah, as you can tell, we have a lot of empathy for both the leader and the employee,
Yeah.
right? There's a lot at stake for both. Leaders are often the target, right? If only they did this, so they were smarter or whatever, right? But leader has a tough job too. So we have a lot of empathy for both. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you can integrate this into your current work practices. So we have inside the ebook, there are 5 different exercises. You can do your own joy at work assessment, and there's some guidance for that, right? And how you can take these and sort of notice what's going on. There's guidance for how you can create joy at work for yourself. That's something that you may or may not think about, right? I don't know that people ask themselves that question very often, doesn't seem like it, but there's some guidance here for you to try it out. And then create joy at work with others. So, you might want to work with your team to try to figure out, okay, well, how can we create these conditions together? We also have a self-reflection guide for an individual to sort of think about this in their daily life, and then a self-reflection guide for that can be used at the team level. And these are some of the questions that this is kind of the framework that we use for teams. And we have a little exercise there. And because we are really thinking about psychological safety, we also include boundaries for team discussion to make sure that this is actually a very positive experience for everyone. One of the things that's so interesting about doing this is we tend to, as people, working people, tend to think critically about things, right? That's our training, to look at a problem and look at it very critically. And that makes sense, right? But in this space, it's better to be in the positive mindset as opposed to the critical space, because critique actually can shut people down, when in fact you want to instead think about possibilities and be more abundant thinking, especially if you have an experience that you've had in the past that was really exceptional, really noteworthy for you. Just reconnecting to that reminds you that this is possible. And when you start to connect with others and their stories, you are now collectively realizing, oh, we all have these stories with us. We don't talk about them. They're like blips on the screen or something. It's really interesting. But you all have them inside you. And when you start to realize, hey, we have these shared experiences that are real, we can start to create, you start to believe that you can create this positive joy experience at work. So this is something that we're going to put in the chat. This is something we published, I guess, well, in March, it says right there, that has a summary of the things that we heard from people about the best team experience. And so it goes into all of those questions. Also, you can use this yourself. You can the interview process is in there, as well as the questions we ask. So if you want to use this with your leadership team, for example, the process is in there, as well as some lessons learned about what not to do that we included. And then things we want to share that we're working on now. So for the employee, we are looking at how can this research be used to help a person figure out, is in a job interview, is this the right company for me? Is this a place where I can thrive? And then professional development, career path planning. So how can I make choices so that I am having joy at work in the future and growing my joy experience? For leaders and HR folks, we're working on employee onboarding, so how to incorporate these ideas into employee onboarding, and then a question bank for team and employee engagement programs to get at these dimensions. And then for change professionals, we already have a measurement approach that incorporates this, so that's available. And then we also have an organizational impact assessment that includes questions like this in order to bring out the dimensions that are present in that particular change situation. And, you know, the thing is, I think I've been doing this as it relates to change for a long time. I just didn't call it joy at work. I think this is how I thought of change. And so now we can bring it out more explicitly so that others have the ability to talk about it more explicitly in their organizations. So that's it. You can, if you want to follow the research, like I said, we are giving these updates once a quarter. If you want to follow the research, we do have a newsletter, and we will share our findings between these updates on that newsletter.
I'm just putting in the chat now a link for you to go get the guide to Joy at Work, and we've set up a 50% discount code for you guys. So Joy50, you see that in the chat as well. You can also, this is posted on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, but this particular site, we have control to give you a discount code, which Amazon, not surprisingly, will not let us do. So if you want to get it there, please go ahead and grab that. And you can see the depth that Roxanne has been talking about, and take a look at the other 9 dimensions as well.
So that's what we wanted to share. Are there any questions or comments?
Yeah, we called this a webinar, but as you guys can see, it's actually a Zoom meeting. So if you want to just come off of mute, you can.
You're welcome
and
to.
Please just ask your question, or if you want to put something in the chat, that's great.
Hi, this is Hannah. How are
Hi,
you?
Hannah.
So what struck me as interesting is, as I was looking at your 10, and I already forgot what you called them, but principles or categories, it seems to me that if an organization is already excelling in those, that change becomes almost easier. Like it's just, people are ready for it, and they trust, and they have that confidence in the people around them and their leadership. And I'm curious, kind of, do you think that's what failed in the project you started? You started your conversation with that those things weren't there, and so therefore the project just was never even set up to be successful?
Yeah, so I think that when the CEO says it's a disappointment, I mean, that's immediately going to make people go, uh-oh, right? And so that's also a reflection of the culture of the company too, right? So I think it's a combination. I think if the CEO said that it was a disappointment, but we fail and bounce back and whatever, that's not what the message was. The message was, we probably need to shut this down, or this is not going to go, or it's just that you knew what the messages were by being called out like that, right? Which is why people wanted to jump ship. They wanted to jump ship before because there weren't those dimensions in place before, and they knew it was a risk being part of something that was obviously over budget and way off schedule. So the big calling out was kind of the underline of that, like a true, well, if I don't know what would be a bigger signal than that, actually, that you're in trouble. So anyway, so yes, I think you're right. So what we were able to do is create those conditions in isolation on this particular effort. Even though the larger organization didn't have this kind of culture, we were able to create it in isolation for the next 18 months. And so that's what helped us get through, because if we didn't have that, there's just no way it would have happened. There's just no way. It was too hard every day. Hey, hi, Phila.
Yeah, so I got a question. Is a little bit related to what Hannah just asked. And let me kind of preface it with a little bit of a comment. So, it seems like you isolated these indicators. I'm sorry, what's the term?
Dimensions.
Dimensions, right? In a sort of a cross-functional but project-oriented environment, right? And so the question is, when you were interviewing these leaders, do you think that as they were thinking about these dimensions and joy at work specifically, do you think that were they considering joy an organizational element, meaning something to aspire for, regardless of whether you're a project-based team member or you're just an organizational member on your day-to-day functional area coming to work, right? Or what was their mind just thinking about those projects and sort of like, let's call them high impact initiatives that sort of drive this type of behavior? It's I'm sorry, but.
No, that's great. That it was a combination. Some people pointed to something specific, but we talked to a lot of people who talked just about their organization overall. One of the people we talked to was Richard Sheridan, who wrote the book Joy Inc. He runs Menlo, right? That seems like you might know. Yeah. So, and this is how he sets up, right? This is his intention, and how he sets his organization, how he runs his organization. I mean, it's not project related at all. For our example, just happened to be project related. Um, a- and it stood out against the relief of everything we had experienced, um, professionally, individually, anywhere in our career, and certainly not at this organization where we worked at the time. But the people that we talked to, sometimes they would talk about a particular initiative, but mostly they talked about their organization.
Yeah, I think we should also probably mention too that not everybody connected to that phrase. I mean, some people
Right.
told us joy at work is not happening here, essentially. Like
Right.
we work in a dirty environment, it's difficult. We just
Right.
don't think about it that way.
Mhm.
Or there were a few as well that as we were asking them questions, it felt like work. Most of the interviews did not feel like work, but there were a
Right.
few of them where you're just sort of digging and digging, and they just do not
Nope.
think about joy living at work. It was
Right.
pretty clear, which surprised me because I thought for sure we would get a pretty strong selection bias. You know, when you send an email to someone and say, "Hey, can I talk to you about joy at work?" You're sort of expecting that they think joy at work exists.
Right.
And that was not true. You know, there were definitely people that's just not where they were. And then there were some that had some maybe mean spirited to some extent, but kind of a plastic view of joy at work. They could say
Right.
the buzzwords, but it was pretty clear that that's not what they were thinking about. Now, out of the 50 odd folks that we talked to, that's a handful, but you know, that's still 10, 20%, somewhere in there. So it was, and that, you know, is on a somewhat biased sample. So not everybody's buying into this. So it's a
No.
little bit of a mission for us, right? To
Right.
show people and get it out there and show examples of where it's happening, especially in places where people don't expect it, where the work is hard or behind or
Right.
in all those places that in some ways, many ways that we've seen, that's the best place for joy at work to show up because the contrast is so strong and people dive into it in such a big way because they see this opportunity for their work to be so much better.
Yeah, and we have to be careful about how forward we are with this. So, um, just like anything else, you have to meet the organization and the leader wherever they are, right? With this kind of stuff. So, as an example, if I had gone to the steering committee in their inspiration story and said, "Hey, we're going to start an engagement program for the team," there is absolutely no way that I would have been accepted. Zero. They would have been like, "We don't have time for this. We don't have the money for that. I don't want to distract people. They need to get to work. This is a problem." There's no way. So what I did was I started where the pain was, which was the direct leader who was leading the organization, leading the team of 250. That was the right place to start. That was where the biggest risk was. And so we started there. And that's one of the reasons why we set up these little exercises inside the ebook so that you could start wherever you are, wherever the organization is or the leader is, whatever makes sense, right? Step in and then build from there. And that's how we've done this kind of work ever since. Sometimes we don't use the phrase joy at work, or at least joy in the context of like a consulting situation. But we eventually get there if they start to pick up, oh, this is what makes sense to me. But yeah, that's, you know, we have, again, like anything else, you have to meet people where they are.
So Anna's got a question here in the chat, and it's kind of related to what Roxanne was asking about. If we met and addressed resistance, reluctance from the C-suite to see the return of investing in this type of organizational change program, yes. And then how do you link this kind of metrics to the bottom line? It is around what Roxanne is talking about. Like you can bludgeon the team and make them do the work, and you can probably push the whole team over the finish line. You may be able to do it and accomplish every single goal that you set out, but you've diminished the culture and the process, maybe significantly, right? And people talk about programs that did what they were supposed to do, but you know, everyone was broken and bruised and bleeding, and there were dead bodies left in the wake of the program, and you know, it's that kind of language. And when we describe to executives that you could have an energized group, like it doesn't have to be bad. We've even talked with, just to give a particular example, working the same kind of thing with the organization that was doing a layoff for the very first time ever, was eliminating positions. And they were petrified to do it because they were worried about what the impact was going to be on the rest of the culture, which is, great that they're worried about that, but they delayed for like 2 years to go do this stuff. So it was an opportunity to show them that you can do something like that, a change that you really, really dislike, and still be able to drive the culture positively. So it is possible to do. And they bought into that idea. They saw the return on investment in doing it, because the other approach was the rip the Band-Aid off approach.
Yeah.
Eliminate the roles, move the people out quickly, try and get past it is the language of it. How do we get past this as fast as
Right.
possible? I'm like, no, you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you're taking care of the people that are going to be impacted, who have to leave the company, as well as the people, which is everyone else who's impacted, who has to stay at the company.
Yeah.
And that was a winning argument for them.
Yeah, because you don't actually get past it. It's still part of your organization, even if you don't talk about it. Because now people think, oh, this is what's going to happen to me whenever it happens, right? It remains with the employees who stay. They call that survivor's guilt. It doesn't really matter what you call it. That is how people interpret what's happening. So anyway, so yeah, the joy reluctance, we started to connect it to measurement, right? And we started to connect it to the measures that companies already look at as it relates to employee engagement, right? So there's a lot of companies do that. We also connect it to the risk to the risky behavior that, or the behavior that's in place that's a risk to success. So an example of that is information sharing. And even raising risk. Those are really two very concrete things that you can point to. Am I getting the information I need from others to succeed in my role? Am I providing others with information they need to succeed in their role? Do I have solid relationships with the people I need to have solid relationships with because I'm dependent on them to succeed? Do I feel comfortable raising risks? Do I know even how to do that? Do I raise risks in a way that is appropriate or character that somebody would characterize in a way is appropriate emotionally for the level of risk that is there, as opposed to being alarming or going around the established system for getting help and raising risk, things like that. So there's some very specific behavior you can find that that may be a risk to success. You can talk about it as it relates to initiative, or you could talk about it as it relates to the purpose of a department or the purpose of a process or even the purpose of the organization. Just depends on, where you want to focus, what you want to improve, or where you can't make mistakes or where it's most risky.
All right, folks. So it's 12:30, and we said we were going to go to there. So Roxanne and I will hang out, and we'll continue. But we did want to have a close, and we know that you may have another meeting to go to. And so if you do, please go ahead. There's still a couple other questions in the chat, so happy to answer those. Otherwise, for everyone else, thank you.
Yes, thank you
so much for coming.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Thanks. All right. Well, Erica had a couple of good questions. First, she asked about, do we have any examples of people doing this well? And yeah, I think we do. So interestingly, the same CEO that had the quote at the very beginning that Roxanne shared about change being a joy killer, when we were talking about having to do difficult changes, described how much he looks forward to firing someone. And that is not at all as mean as it just came out of my mouth. What I need to say that differently. All right. So what he meant was that it was an opportunity to fix a problem, that somebody was a mismatch. And the prep that he would have for the conversation was around that kind of a discussion. Things aren't matched well here. I want to come up with a way to guide you out of the company successfully help you land where you're going to be able to be successful and do that well. And so make that whole transition something that can be a cultural benefit to the company. So now people don't have to be afraid of what happens if things don't work out for me. They know at least that they're going to get the best exit that they possibly can. And I think if you can do that at the worst end of the spectrum, when you're having to remove somebody from the company for performance, which is so difficult, and be able to do that in a way that actually improves the culture, that's a pretty significant example, I think, of where that is.
It's all about mindset. I mean, he talks about it as I'm going to learn from this too, right? I want them to learn. I want to learn from this too. So almost like there's nothing bad here, right? It's so much about. I was so taken by his mindset. I was like, you need to write about this. People need to hear your perspective on this because that's a very difficult conversation to have.
Yeah, one other question Eric asked us as well is how do you help leaders who think they're doing this well to see that they're actually sending mixed signals instead? So the question around any of these things is kind of judgment of how well I'm doing on something that we love to pose to leaders is how do you know? So if you ask them, oh yeah, I'm great on this 10 dimensions, all at the max, this is the most joyful place in the known universe. But then the follow-up question to that is, well, how do you know? And most of the time, if it's somebody that we're thinking doesn't really know where they are, they aren't really doing anything to know. They're not asking. There's no survey. There aren't any other instruments. They're not even necessarily looking at business metrics that might tell you that something good was going on, like retention metrics or how many people are knocking on the door for every single opening that you have.
Yeah.
And instead it's sort of a qualitative, yeah, I'm great. But when we pose that question, not all for sure, because there's some people that kind of will just buffalo through it, but some will stop and pause to think about it and go, I really don't have an external measure.
Yeah.
And that does seem to help at least getting them to think about, well, maybe I should ask or come up with a survey or come up with something, some other metric that helps me to understand whether or not this is going well.
Yeah. Awesome.
Other questions or thoughts? All right, guys. Well, we are always happy to talk about this. So please reach out and tell us what you're thinking or what questions you have. And if you do have other people that you think would be good for us to interview, we'd always appreciate introductions. One of the great things that we've gotten recently, it's not great to have a pandemic, but great that people are okay doing things on Zoom, is we get to talk to people all over the country now without having to travel to go see them. So that's been really great. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, guys. Good to see you.
Bye, guys. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thank you.
Excellent work. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.